forming. And to their surprise, actually, in the beginning, they started detecting molecules. So first it was small molecules like ammonia, formaldehyde, and hydrogen cyanide. And then soon they were detecting bigger things like methanol, cyanoacetylene, and acetaldehyde. So in the early 70s, there was this flurry of review articles describing this newly discovered interstellar organic chemistry. And in these review articles, the authors took note that a lot of these small to mid-size organics that they were seeing in star-forming regions are actually the same ingredients that are needed for prebiotic chemical schemes in early Earth scenarios. So this was sort of the beginning of some speculations that interstellar organic chemistry could have some meaningful connection to origins of life chemistry. So if we fast forward 50 years to where we are now, we obviously have a much more detailed understanding of how this interstellar chemistry works and how planets actually form. But this basic idea still is a major motivation of astrochemistry today, which is that by studying the chemical environment in which stars and planets are born, we can learn something about how prebiotic building blocks are delivered to new worlds. So this raises the question, what do I mean when I say a prebiotic building block? And there's sort of two ways that we can think about this. So at the very most basic level, we could think of just the sort of most fundamental elements that are used in all of terrestrial biochemistry. So here on Earth, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur show up in all forms of life. And so from this very simple perspective, we might just want to understand what is the inventory of these biogenic elements that are incorporated into a planet. So to understand this, we simply want to understand the bulk compositions of planet-forming gas and solids and sort of how much mass of these different elements might make its way into a planet. On the other end of the spectrum, we know that there's this wealth of chemical complexity present in star-forming regions. So we also might want to understand, are any of these chemically complex, potentially prebiotically useful molecules actually delivered intact to planetary surfaces? So we don't expect that volatile molecules incorporated into the planet when it initially forms will actually survive, because planet formation is a very energetic and sometimes violent process. So from this perspective, we instead want to understand the molecular content of icy planetesimals in the outer solar system that could then deliver their molecular content through impacts later on after the planet has actually formed. So we don't know how origins of life happen here on Earth. So I think it's useful to sort of keep both of these perspectives in mind and be a little bit agnostic when we're trying to think about planet formation chemistry. So it's an especially exciting time to be thinking about planet formation chemistry because, as we know, astronomers are now discovering all of these potential habitable exoplanet candidates in systems around other stars. And we're still in the very early days of understanding the properties of these potentially habitable exoplanets. So right now, this list is planets that are likely to have a rocky composition and maintain surface liquid water. But this is obviously just the start. So ultimately, we also want to know, did these potential Earth analogs also inherit these volatile ingredients for origins of life chemistry? And answering this question by actually characterizing the volatile compositions of these rocky exoplanets is going to be virtually impossible for at least another 2 decades. So instead, we can still characterize the chemical environment that planets are assembling in and try to get some better handle on how planets might be seeded with these biocritical elements. And then ultimately, when these next generation space telescopes come along, this foundation of planet formation chemistry will help us to contextualize these future rocky planet atmosphere observations and to try to interpret how different planets might have obtained different volatile compositions. Okay, so how do we study planet formation chemistry? We have a lot of different tools at our disposal. So I'm going to be using this schematic throughout the talk, and I'm just going to start by walking through some of these different approaches that we can use to look at planet formation chemistry. Okay, so the first thing that we need to consider is that volatile molecules and elements can either exist in the gas phase or the ice phase in star-forming regions. And this distinction is important because the chemistries of these 2 phases play out really differently. And this is basically due to the fact that this chemistry is proceeding at really low temperatures and densities that places some constraints on the types of reactions that can happen. So in the gas phase, reactions are most efficient between, for instance, ions and neutral molecules. And this leads to the production of some very interesting and exotic species, like these long unsaturated carbon chains, but isn't necessarily productive for forming molecules that are interesting from a prebiotic perspective. Instead, we think that the surfaces of dust grains are where a lot of this interesting chemistry happens. So when it's very cold and dense, the volatiles will freeze out of the gas phase, condense onto these grain surfaces, and within these icy mantles, you can actually overcome some of the obstacles to the chemistry that are operating in the gas phase and form organics. So as a sort of note of terminology, in astrochemistry, we call something a complex organic molecule if it's about 6 atoms or bigger. So these are still relatively small molecules from a terrestrial perspective, but it is sort of a more interesting level of complexity for things that we can study using remote methods. Okay, so we can study these gases and ices at all stages along the star formation sequence. So we know that forming a planetary system is basically a byproduct of forming stars like our sun. So this begins in a molecular cloud when you have some overdensity of material collapse in on itself, leading to the formation of a protostar. And in the early stages, the protostar is still embedded in its envelope, and it may have a small protostellar disk around it. Ultimately, the disk is sort of coalesced into this flattened protoplanetary disk structure that is isolated from its envelope. And historically, the protoplanetary disk phase is what has been most interesting from the perspective of planet formation, because finally here you have high enough densities that grain growth can really kick off and planet formation can get underway. So ultimately, anything that isn't incorporated into planets or the star is blown out of the system, and you're just left with your planetary system. So ultimately, we know that at each of these evolutionary stages, the chemistry is set by a combination of inheritance from the previous stage and also some reprocessing of material because the physical environment is changing as well. So if we want to understand planet formation chemistry, we would like to understand the chemical composition of the protoplanetary disk, but also its evolutionary progenitors, because some of that material is going to be inherited and sort of set the stage for the disk. Okay, so we have a few different sort of tools in our astrochemical toolbox that we can use to study this chemistry. Observationally, we can basically get direct constraints on the abundances and distributions of some molecules in these regions. And we can also get better constraints on the physical conditions that are characterizing these star and planet forming regions. We can also use lab experiments to make measurements of how microphysics and chemistry proceeds in a very controlled way. And we can use models to make predictions for how this chemistry plays out in much more complex and realistic environments. So coming back to the schematic, you can see that we have sort of a lot to consider for this question. But throughout the talk, I'm going to be using this as a guide where basically we'll take one sort of slice from each layer of this wheel, depending on the question that we're trying to answer. So you'll see how it works as we go. So where are we going for the science part of this talk? We're going to start by thinking about how chemical complexity is built up in the early stages of star formation. We'll move on to thinking about what of this early chemistry can survive the formation and evolution of the disk. And then lastly, we'll think about whether the disk stage itself is playing any unique role in the processing of material prior to planet formation. Okay, so jumping into this first question, I think something that's been a little bit surprising over the past decade is we're learning that complex organic molecules are actually pretty common even in the earliest stages of star formation. And there's some really nice work actually at Arizona doing this work. So it's actually not obvious in these very cold and sort of energy-starved environments how you have enough energy around to be forming these large complex molecules. So this was a question that's been very interesting to me. Because we're thinking about organic molecules, we need to be considering what's happening in the ice phase. And so if we think about these interstellar ices, there's a number of different microphysical and chemical processes that are basically going to regulate how new molecules can form. So this includes things like accretion and desorption that populate and depopulate these ices with new molecules. There are processes within the ices like diffusion and reaction to form new molecules. And then also photo processes are very important. So things like dissociation or desorption stimulated by a photon. So ultimately, we want to understand how these different microphysical processes work in order to explain how organics can form in different interstellar environments. So fortunately, we can do some of this in the lab. So we're talking about ice chemistry experiments in the lab. This is the setup that I worked on during my PhD. It's an ultra high vacuum chamber, so we can achieve pressures that are about 13 orders of magnitude below atmospheric pressure and temperatures down around 10 Kelvin. So we're really mimicking sort of space-like environments. And as a little schematic of the types of tools we use for these experiments, the whole chamber is pumped down to very low pressures. This cesium iodide window is cooled to the very low temperatures, so we can allow volatile molecules into the chamber through this gas inlet. They condense onto the window to form whatever ice we're studying, and then we can use infrared spectroscopy to characterize the composition of the ice in situ. We can also keep track of the gas phase using QMS, and then if we need some light source, we can use something like a UV lamp. So again, I'm going to focus in this talk on this question of what types of ice phase pathways could actually lead to chemical complexity, even in the coldest interstellar regions. So I'll talk today about one kind of pathway that I think is showing particular promise, and this is chemistry that involves excited state oxygen atoms. So it turns out that when you energetically process common bearing oxygen ices like CO2 or water, you will produce what's called an electronically excited atom, or an O singlet D atom. So in the case where you would irradiate a CO2 molecule with Lyman alpha, you break it apart into CO and then one of these excited oxygen atoms. So these are interesting because from gas phase chemistry, we know that these excited atoms can actually insert directly into a CH bond of a hydrocarbon to form an organic molecule directly from a hydrocarbon. So in the simplest case, you would insert oxygen into methane to form methanol directly. So this has been really well studied in the gas phase. It's known that it has no reaction barrier and you have a very favorable formation of this organic product. But actually in the gas phase, you can't stabilize this product, so it tends to fall apart into radical fragments. So it's really not allowing you to build up new complexity through gas phase chemistry. So we wanted to understand how this insertion chemistry might proceed in the solid state instead. So to do so, we need to figure out a way to actually isolate the reactivity of oxygen atoms within an ice mixture. So the way that we did this, we made a mixed ice composed of methane and O2, and then we irradiate it with this UV lamp, but we can actually filter out the wavelengths that dissociate methane, so we can selectively break apart O2 within these ice mixtures, allowing us to sort of specifically track the chemistry coming from these oxygen atoms. So if we want to understand the energetics of this process, we need to model the kinetics. So here I'm showing an example experiment where you're looking at the evolution of the infrared spectrum over the course of the experiment. You can see the growth of this nice methanol band, and this is quantified on the bottom in this growth curve. So we can take this type of data, fit it with a simple kinetic model that just describes the reaction rate constant, and then plot it as a function of temperature. So the game here becomes, you do this at many temperatures, and then the slope of this plot will tell you the activation barrier of the reaction. So when we did this for this particular reaction, we actually found a flat temperature dependence. So this is telling us that these reactions have no energy barriers, and this is great news if you're trying to do this in cold environments because you don't need any sort of extra thermal energy around for this process to run. So in addition to getting some sort of quantitative numbers out of it, we can also do things like constraining the reaction mechanism, understanding how all the different species that are formed in our ice are related to one another. And we can also get branching ratios out, so understanding how much of the product is going to methanol versus these other sort of carbon-bearing byproducts. So this is great that we can make methanol, but ultimately we want to form bigger and more interesting things as well. So the next thing we did was sort of extend this. to see how these oxygen atoms interact with larger hydrocarbons. So we tested the ethane, ethylene, and acetylene, and we found that in all cases, we can form sort of a variety of oxygen-bearing organics with a barrierless reaction. So if we look at sort of real protostellar lines of sight, we can see that there is a lot of potential complexity molecules like ethanol, acetaldehyde, and methanol. And a lot of these are things that we can produce through this oxygen atom chemistry that I just talked about. So it's exciting that this type of chemistry could be contributing to the buildup of chemical complexity, even in these very early sort of cold stages. And just sort of a highlight that there's obviously a lot more to come. These spectra will get much better with James Webb now sort of online and taking data. And as our spectra get better, we're going to continue to need these sort of lab constraints on the types of mechanisms that are active in the ices to explain this much more detailed data that we're going to get with James Webb. Okay, so we've talked about how we can use these experiments to understand how chemical complexity can be built up in these early star forming stages. And this is actually important because, as I mentioned before, there are signatures within our own solar system that some of the composition of material seems to be inherited from the earliest stages of star formation. So one really nice way to visualize this is looking at the organic composition of a low mass protostar compared to the solar system comet 67P, and we see just a sort of a remarkable correspondence in the compositions of these two objects, suggestive of chemical inheritance from earlier stages of star formation. And even when we look at more processed bodies like meteorites, there are still isotopic anomalies that seem to require at least a partial inheritance of interstellar material to explain the signatures that we're seeing. So this brings us to sort of the second stage of this talk, which is trying to understand of this early chemistry, what is actually surviving the formation and evolution of the disk. So let's start by thinking, is inheritance plausible? When we think about the structure of a protoplanetary disk, we know that there's a very steep gradient in the vertical direction because the surface of the disk is getting bombarded by photons from the central star. And then as you move deeper into the disk, it becomes shielded from radiation and a lot colder. So in principle, if you can incorporate your interstellar ices into the midplane of the disk, they should then be pretty well protected from reprocessing, and this could explain these inheritance signatures that we see. But we know that the story isn't that simple. Disks are very dynamic, so there are processes like vertical mixing, vertical settling, and radial drift that are redistributing material through these different physical environments in the disk. And so the question that I've been thinking about more lately is, can interstellar ices actually survive their journey through the disk given this very dynamical context? So here we're going to pivot to using models of ice phase chemistry in disks to answer this question. Okay, so to get at this, we developed a new sort of simulation framework. The physical side is a particle tracking model where we basically account for various dynamical effects on individual dust grains, things like turbulent mixing, vertical settling, and drift. So this is an example of a micron-sized particle that is initialized at the disk midplane. And over the course of 1 million years, you can see that it wanders around through these different regions of the disk, being exposed to different physical conditions as it goes. We then developed an ice model that tries to really mimic both the structure and the composition of an ice as you would inherit it from the protostar. So this consists of a pretty thick layer of water-rich ice that's capped with a thinner layer of CO-rich ice. And then we take this protostellar-like ice model and we subject it to different destructive processes like thermal desorption, photodesorption, and photodissociation. So then for individual grains, we can sort of map how ices are destroyed as they're wandering through these different environments of the disk. Okay, so I'll give some examples of how these simulations play out. This is a micron-sized grain that was initialized at 20 AU. You're going to be looking on the left here at the particle's position in the disk as a function of elevation and radius. This plot will show you the UV flux that the particle is experiencing. And then these right two panels will show you the thickness of water and CO ice on the grain. And you'll see two lines. One is sort of the parent molecule, and the other is its photodissociation products. So we can see this particle begins its life sort of shielded in the midplane. Nothing really is happening. And then at some point it wanders into these UV exposed layers of the disk, and you get these really extreme pulses of UV. And you can see they're quite destructive for the ices on this grain. So by the end of the simulation, the particle has no ice left on it. In contrast, here is a micron-sized grain that's initialized further out in the disk. And you can see it's actually going to wander further away from the midplane. But because the UV field is weaker in the outer disk, the processing is a little bit gentler. So we have some sort of processing events for our ice, but by the end of the simulation, there's still plenty of ice left on this grain. So the take home here is that when we couple physics and chemistry like this, we see very different outcomes of ice loss for different grains. And this is largely controlled by how efficiently different particles are transported into the UV exposed layers of the disk. So here's a summary of just physical trajectories where we're looking from left to right at particles initialized at increasing disk radius. And then from top to bottom, we're looking at particles of increasing grain size. So some trends that you might notice is that as we move from the inner disk to the outer disk, particles are lofted further away from the midplane. But as we just saw, the UV field is actually gentler in the outer disk, so the processing will actually be less destructive in these cases. And then as we move from, as we move from small to large grains, we see that the particles are more sort of confined to the midplane, but they also start to become subject to radial drift. So by a millimeter in size, the grains you can really see start to spiral inwards towards the star. So with thousands of these particle trajectories, we can start to assemble some statistics for how ice loss should proceed in this dynamical disk model. And so this is sort of the summary plot. On the y-axis, you're looking at the fraction of the ice mantle that's left intact after 100,000 years. The x-axis is showing the different radii in the disk where we initialize particles, and then the different colors are showing the different grain sizes, where the dots are sort of the median across hundreds of particles within each batch, and then the bars are showing the 25th to 75th percentile outcomes. Okay, so the take home here is that when we look at small grains, 1 in 10 micron in the inner disks, we see that they're actually really efficiently losing their ice mantle. So in the regions where you expect comets to be forming, which is about 30 AU or smaller, small grains are not really holding on to their ices. We also can notice that larger grains are not really experiencing any ice loss on the timescales of these simulations anywhere in the disk. So the important take home here is that it's actually really difficult to explain inheritance of these ices in comets if they're forming through the hierarchical assembly of local material. So in other words, you can't really start with small interstellar sized particles and grow them bigger in size while still preserving their ices intact. So what we think is a more plausible pathway to inheritance is to grow from small to larger sizes further out in the disk. So even out here at 150 AU, these small grains are losing maybe 10 or 20% of their initial ice reservoir, but still keeping much of it intact. So as these small grains grow, they'll still sort of preserve a lot of their icy reservoir. And then once they become large enough in size, they'll become subject to drift. So they'll bring this mostly pristine icy material through the comet forming zone, where it could then be incorporated into comets. So as I'm sure this audience is well aware, this framework of pebble drift and pebble accretion is actually becoming very popular as a way to explain a lot of problems in planet formation. And so I think it's really nice that here we have sort of an independent chemical signature that the same process was at play in the formation of comets in our own solar system. I think this is also nice because By providing a sort of plausible scenario for how this pristine material is incorporated into comets, I think this sort of solidifies the link between interstellar chemistry and a potential later delivery to planetary surfaces through these impacting icy bodies. Okay, so that brings us then to sort of the third question of this talk, which is what is actually the role of reprocessing within the disk? So here we're going to pivot to using gas phase observations of protoplanetary disks. It is a very exciting time to be doing disk chemistry observations, thanks in large part to ALMA, as I'm sure everyone has heard of. So this is the gratuitous comparison showing the same molecular line image towards the same disk with SMA, ALMA at moderate spatial resolution, and ALMA at high resolution, at high resolution. And you can see that we can just see this really kind of exquisite detail in the molecular emission patterns of this molecule within the disk, and we can detect much fainter emission than we were previously able to. So in my very biased opinion, I think one of the most exciting things coming out of ALMA in the early days was the first detections of complex molecules in disks. So only small molecules had been detected in disks previously. In 2015, methyl cyanide was detected in a disk for the first time, followed a year later by methanol. But still we have a pretty rudimentary understanding of the complex organic chemistry in disks. So questions like, are these complex organics common or rare? Are they inherited from protostars or formed through some processing in the disk? And are they important or minor species as far as the total volatile budget goes? So to answer some of these questions, we went out and surveyed two of these complex nitriles, methyl cyanide and cyanoacetylene, in a sample of disks. Jumping straight into it, we detected methyl cyanide firmly in 3 of the 6 disks with 2 additional tentative detections. And cyanoacetylene, we had 5 firm detections in this sample. So it's pretty exciting that now that we actually have the sensitivity to go looking for these more complex species, we're finding that they're actually quite common in disks. So we can be a little more quantitative and actually figure out how important these complex nitriles are relative to simpler volatiles in the disk. So to do this, we developed a physical model for the disk that describes the temperature and density as a function of position in the disk. And then we can just use a simple parametric abundance profile that describes the abundance of each molecule as a function of radius. And we can generate these synthetic observations, match them to the real observations, and sort of figure out what the abundance profiles look like. So this is what we pull out. On the y-axis, you're looking at the abundance ratio of methyl cyanide or cyanoacetylene relative to the simple nitrile carrier HCN as a function of radius. And what we found is that in the inner 100 AU of the disk, methyl cyanide accounts for maybe 1 to 10% of with respect to HCN, and cyanoacetylene is actually as abundant as HCN in parts of the disk. So the take home here is that these complex molecules are actually important carriers of the nitrile bond. So if we want to understand sort of the full picture of volatile chemistry in disks, we have to be considering these more complex species as well as the simple ones. So we can now sort of compare the complex chemistry in the disk stage with earlier stages of star formation. So here I'm showing the methyl cyanide to methanol ratio, where methanol is just sort of the oxygen-bearing analog of methyl cyanide. And so for the 3 disks where methanol has been either detected or we have a constraining upper limit, we find that the methyl cyanide to methanol ratio is sort of order unity. When we look at the earlier stages of star formation, we see that there's actually about a 2 order of magnitude increase in the methyl cyanide to methanol ratio over a pretty short time scale. So something kind of crazy is going on in the disks that's really enhancing the nitrogen organic chemistry relative to oxygen compared to this stage right before it. Okay, so there's actually a pretty compelling explanation for why we would be seeing these kind of weird chemical patterns in disks, and it has to do with how the physical and chemical evolution of the disk is coupled. So the idea is that in a young unevolved disks, you have small particles coated in ices that are sort of distributed throughout the vertical extent of the disk. And then as the disk evolves, these particles grow and they settle to the midplane, carrying this icy reservoir with them. So you end up with a midplane that's very rich in things like water ice, and then an atmosphere of the disk that's very depleted in gas phase oxygen. So the net effect is that oxygen is being sequestered in the midplane of the disk as a result of grain evolution. Now, models predict that when you pull oxygen out of the gas like this, you should promote a reducing chemistry, which means that you should really efficiently form molecules like nitriles, things with CN bonds, and hydrocarbons, things like CH bonds. So qualitatively, this can sort of explain the very kind of unusually bright emission of these complex nitriles that we're beginning to see in disks. What we still don't understand is whether this oxygen depletion gas framework can systematically explain the emission of nitriles and hydrocarbons. So to answer this, we set out to perform a more statistical survey of the hydrocarbon, nitrile, and oxygen chemistry in what for disk chemistry is a big sample of 14 objects. So here's a gallery showing for a subset of the disks, images of C2H, HCN, and CO. So we have our hydrocarbon, our nitrile, and our oxygen tracer. And you can see sort of right away that we have a really wide diversity in the emission patterns of these different molecules. So both when we look at one molecule across different disks or different molecules across the same disk, there's quite a number of different chemical patterns that are showing up. And this seems to speak to the fact that we have different outcomes in these different physical environments disk to disk. So with these observations, we were able to pull out C2H and HCN abundances. And what we found is that the abundances are actually positively correlated. So disks with bright C2H emission also have bright HCN emission. And this speaks to a shared formation chemistry. This is actually exactly what we would expect from this oxygen depletion framework. So when you pull oxygen out of the gas, you should simultaneously promote the formation of molecules like nitriles and hydrocarbons. So I think it's really exciting that with these bigger samples, we're starting to be able to actually test some of the underlying mechanisms of disk chemistry. And I think as we go forward, there's more of this to come, hopefully with even bigger and more definitive sample sizes. Okay, so let's step back for a second and think about some implications for prebiotic chemistry. So it turns out that prebiotic chemists really like nitriles. They're very reactive sort of carbon-bearing molecules that allow you to build up things like RNA, protein, and lipid precursors more easily than you could with other sort of building blocks. So in light of this, I think it's pretty interesting that the oxygen-poor gas within protoplanetary disks seems to be uniquely efficient at producing nitriles relative to earlier stages of star formation. So perhaps it's the case that during the assembly of planets, as you're sort of fractionating the gas in this way, you're allowing this environment that drives the formation of this particular class of prebiotically useful molecules. Okay, so a little bit more on nitriles. We recently had the MAPS ALMA large program that imaged 5 protoplanetary disks in a whole suite of molecular lines using the highest spatial resolution that you can really achieve. And so I'm going to talk for just a couple of minutes about CN and HCN in the MAPS program. So you can see sort of images of the 5 disks in CN and HCN here. And with this high spatial resolution, we can start to understand the chemistry in a more detailed way. So for instance, how does the nitrile chemistry vary radially within the disk? And what mechanisms are driving the production and the relative abundances of different nitrile carriers? Okay, so for instance, here I'm showing the CN to HCN column density ratio as a function of radius in the disk. And you can start to see some really interesting trends in these abundance profiles. So perhaps the most obvious is that we see in all of the disks that the CN to HCN ratio is increasing by about 2 orders of magnitude from the inner disk to the outer disks. There's a substantial variation within the disks in terms of the relative importance of these small nitriles. So we can actually explain this as a UV-driven effect. The idea is that as you move from the inner disk to the outer disk, the dust density is getting lower, and this allows the UV to penetrate more deeply into the disk. So if you have some population of small nitriles where CN is a UV stable molecule and HCN is subject to photodissociation, you can see how we would end up accumulating relatively more CN in the outer disk relative to HCN just because of the amount of UV that's penetrating in the outer disk. So this sort of tells us that photochemistry is actually a major factor in driving the production and relative abundances of nitriles in the disk gas. And this is something that was predicted for quite a long time, but it hasn't been until we've had these spatially resolved observations that we could actually sort of test this mechanism. So in addition to these large-scale trends, you'll also notice some interesting small-scale features. So we want to understand where those are coming from as well. And in some cases, we have a really satisfying explanation. So take MWC480. This is the dust image, and you can see when we sort of map it out that the CN to HCN ratio seems to peak at the positions of millimeter gaps and to have troughs at the positions of millimeter rings. So this is sort of consistent with this larger scale trend that we saw before, where you're enhancing CN over HCN in regions where there's less dust and more UV penetration. So that's a nice story, but that doesn't explain most of the features that we see. So in a lot of cases, we don't have such a clear-cut explanation. So there's definitely no universal relationship between dust features and the CN emission. So it seems like it's a pretty complex interplay of physics and chemistry that's driving a lot of these smaller sort of wiggles that we're observing. So just to sort of take home here is these large scale trends do seem consistent with a UV driven chemistry that is radially dependent, and it's sort of active in the surface layers of the disk, whereas the small scale trends really depend on the detail and remain difficult for us to interpret. All right, so I've spent a lot of this talk talking about carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, and that's actually for a very practical reason that carriers of these elements are easy to detect at all stages of star formation, from the earliest stages through to the protoplanetary disk stage. So when we consider our biogenic elements, phosphorus is really the oddball here. We have by far the fewest astrophysical constraints on the phosphorus chemistry. So I'll just take a couple minutes to talk a little bit about some work that we've been doing, trying to sort of expand our understanding of phosphorus chemistry in star forming regions. So here, phosphorus has actually never been detected in a disk, so we have to step backwards and look at gas phase observations of protostars. All right, so a couple of years ago, we were very excited to serendipitously detect two phosphorus molecules towards a low mass protostar B1A. So these were observations taken with the single dish IRM 30-meter telescope. We had really nice detections of these molecules. And this is actually only the second time that phosphorus carriers were detected towards any sun-like star-forming region. So we didn't have a whole lot of information with the single dish data, but we did have some sort of auxiliary constraints on the source structure from a different interferometric program. And we can see that in SIO, the emission is sort of tracing this sort of funky outflow structure coming out south of the protostar. So based on this and some sort of circumstantial evidence, the hypothesis is that phosphorus is generally stored in a refractory carrier in the dense interstellar medium, and it's only within outflow shocks in these star-forming regions that it's actually released into the gas, where we can detect it in a volatile form. So based on this, we then went to try to detect phosphorus towards more sources, sort of fishing expedition targeting 7 low mass sources where the outflows are well characterized. So hopefully we can learn something about what is actually driving the release of phosphorus into the gas. And this is work that a student was working on. So Serena Wormser is at Harvard. This paper just came out. And we ended up detecting phosphorus molecules towards 3 new sources. So really expanding the sample that we can study the phosphorus chemistry in these low mass sources. So I won't go into too much detail, but essentially with an increased sample size, we can start to learn something about the demographics of phosphorus chemistry and the physics that's responsible for phosphorus in the gas phase. What I think is maybe even more exciting is actually imaging the emission of phosphorus molecules towards this original source. So we were able to get ALMA follow-up observations towards B1A, and we can now actually map the emission of phosphorus within the protostellar core. So the first thing we wanted to do is understand sort of, is our hypothesis correct? Is the phosphorus coming from the outflow like we suspected? So when we overplot the SiO emission towards the same source, we see that in the south, it's sort of coincident, but actually in the north, the phosphorus molecules are clearly not coming from the SiO outflow. So this was a bit of a puzzle. We went searching through the data to try to understand what could explain this emission pattern. And we ended up finding this very sort of dense filamentary structure in our data traced by CCS. So CCS traces sort of dense, pristine material, and you'll notice that the phosphorus molecules seem to be localized to the regions where the SiO outflow is impacting this filament. So our suspicion now is that the phosphorus molecules are not really coming from the same material as the SiO outflow, but it's that the outflow impacting on this filament is causing some sort of shocking of this more pristine material that releases the phosphorus into the gas. So we can also look at how the phosphorus emission compares with some weak shock tracers like SO2, which seems to come into the gas when ices are sputtered into the gas. And here we see a really close correspondence between the phosphorus molecules and the SO2. So now we can try to learn something about the parent phosphorus molecule or phosphorus carrier in the grain that's responsible for the gas phase emission that we see. So I'm showing here a volatility plot where high numbers are more refractory things and low numbers are more volatile things. And then for reference, we have water and silicates. So based on these emission patterns, it seems that the parent phosphorus carrier should be more volatile than silicates because we're seeing it co-spatially with these sort of ice sublimation tracers that only require weak shocks. On the other hand, we think that the parent phosphorus carrier should be less volatile than simple ices like water. And the reason for this is that phosphorus has never been detected towards a protostellar hot core or hot carino. So whatever temperatures are warm enough to thermally sublimate water is still not enough energy to put phosphorus in the gas. So we only really see it in these more energetic shocked environments. So we can put up some candidate phosphorus carriers based on what we understand about the solar system. And we actually think that based on the volatility that metal phases of phosphorus like schreibersite are not good carriers to explain the gas phase PN emission because the volatility is too similar to this silicate. And so we would expect the morphology to look more like SiO. So instead, something like these phosphate minerals or phosphorus oxides seem to be a better candidate for explaining the emission that we're seeing. So I think it's really intriguing that with these kind of spatial emission patterns, we can actually start to say something about the identity of carriers in the grain phase that we don't normally have access to. So the last thing that I'll talk about relating to phosphorus is the sort of contextualization of the recent detection of volatile phosphorus in cometary ices. So PO, a volatile phosphorus carrier, was detected towards Comet 67P as part of the Rosetta mission a couple of years back, with actually a pretty high volatile phosphorus abundance. So how do we explain this volatile phosphorus in the comet? We know from the early stages of star formation that gas phase phosphorus is not present. So in the early stages, it seems like most of the phosphorus needs to be stored in a refractory or a semi-refractory form. And like I said, in more evolved sources, phosphorus is not detected in hot carinos. It's only really detected in these more kind of shocked energetic environments. So whatever phosphorus is present in these early stages is probably not volatile. And what we think is that actually interstellar shocks are playing a role in converting this more kind of primitive semi-refractory phosphorus carrier to a volatile form in order to explain how any volatile phosphorus would be around to be incorporated into cometary phases. Okay, so revisiting our roadmap, we started by talking about how chemical complexity can be built up in early star forming stages and how we can use lab experiments to actually understand these different chemical and microphysical processes that are regulating how molecules form in ices. We then moved on to thinking about what of this early chemistry survives the formation and evolution of the disk. There's clear signatures of inheritance in our own solar system, and we provided a sort of plausible framework to explain how this inheritance could happen even in a dynamical disk. And then lastly, we talked about the role that the disk might play and how, because of the way that the physical and chemical evolution is coupled, we end up with a very oxygen-poor gas in the disk that seems to promote the production of these prebiotically interesting nitriles alongside the formation of planets. So with that, I will just leave up a quick summary, hopefully shown that using all of these different tools, we can assemble the most complete picture possible of the chemistry that is affecting planet formation. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jenny. So any question, please raise your hand to the Zoom audience. And if you have a question. Yeah. Yes, Andrew.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the really nice talk. Was looking to learn more about chemistry. You mentioned the possibility that pebble accretion, the pebble accretion mechanism, could help with, I guess, getting rapidly drifting pebbles that have these volatiles in them onto, I thought in particular, perhaps cometary mass objects. And so the comment in question that I had on that was that pebble accretion is sort of known to only really be effective sort of at and above Pluto's mass. And you don't get much accretion below that. And so since most comets are obviously orders of magnitude lower in mass than Pluto, I'm wondering if anyone's looked in detail at whether the lower accretion rates at lower masses could be relevant.
Interesting point. Yeah, good to look into. Thanks.
If I could do a quick follow-up on that, I thought you showed, and it went a little quickly for me, the I guess evidence that there was some inheritance, and I guess it was different species relative to methanol. And so I didn't quite get what that was showing, since there were a lot of different species involved.
Yeah, so I guess there's sort of two main lines of evidence for the inheritance in comets and primitive meteorites. Compositionally, the plot that I showed is that the abundances, if you look at sort of the organic composition, so basically any organic that we can detect normalized relative to methanol, the abundances, the relative abundances in comets and in low mass protostars seem to agree really well. So the composition of comets seem to be really consistent with the composition of material that's present in the sort of earlier evolutionary stages. But perhaps the more, I guess, unambiguous evidence is isotopic. So a lot of the cometary molecules have enrichments in rare isotopes that require really low temperatures. And so that is actually really difficult to explain without inheriting some of that material from the early stages. So it's especially pronounced in comets, but I think I did mention that also in more processed bodies like primitive meteorites, you also see some sort of isotopic anomalies that seem to require an interstellar contribution to the composition of the original bodies.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, so I just say that based on sort of the masses involved, that this maybe argues for an early gravitational collapse phase to capture these volatiles, and that might work as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so Yancy.
Yeah, hi, Jenny. In terms of the complex organics in the disk, what do you think is the next direction we should be going with ALMA? Should we be looking at oxygen-bearing species and trying to do really deep integrations to go after things like acetaldehyde, or should it be more the nitrogen-bearing things like a vinyl cyanide? And what's the likelihood, like how long you have to integrate, you think, to try to detect these things and get constraints in the disks?
Yeah, I'm on a program for this coming cycle that will try to detect larger nitriles. I think that's definitely seeming like a more promising pathway than the oxygen-bearing molecules, because I mean, methanol has only been detected firmly in 1 or 2 disks, right? So yeah, it seems like I don't know, until Alma is comfortable doing like 20-hour integrations on a source to detect one molecule, then maybe we need to leave the oxygen chemistry sort of to the side for a little while. But I think the nitrogen chemistry is promising.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, next, Maitri.
Hi.
Hi, Jenny. Great talk. I loved it. I really like the way you connected all the three topics together and showed the work that you've been doing. I needed a clarification and I have a question. Talked about survival of the interstellar organics, once it's introduced to our disk, right?
Mhm.
You talk about small grains not retaining the ices, the larger ones might be showing less ice loss. Do you assume that when you say ice loss happens in the small grains, the organic materials that are in there are also lost in the process? Because it's possible that they are on the grain surface and they don't volatilize at all, right? Am I understanding that correctly? Or
So are you saying, I guess, to clarify your clarification, are you saying that the organics would remain on the grain even when smaller volatiles are lost?
is there a reason not to, for it to not to leave the system? I mean, if the
Well,
temperatures are not hot enough, then why would they?
So it's a photo effect. So photons can desorb molecules. So sort of mid-sized organics will be kicked off of the grains into the gas phase in these UV exposed layers of the disk. So it's not even really a thermal effect, it's a photo effect. But if you get sort of big enough molecules, then they do become very sticky and hard to get off the grain. So I think the question that we don't really understand yet is, I mean, there's a lot of this like big sort of macromolecular organic material that's seen in meteorites. And I think what we don't understand yet is whether that could have formed very early on and been sort of present by the time the disk formed, or whether it was sort of in situ disk processes that led to the production of those macromolecular organics. So if they are present in the earlier stages, then yeah, those would probably stay on the grains.
Right. Okay. And then the question, it's kind of related to the kerogen, where you talk about phosphorus being, in the apatites or the oxides, but what about the kerogen? Because we know that they should have a lot of phosphorus, and I know Lucy Lucy Zuri is doing a lot of work on that. So, I'm wondering why, or is there a way to probe if it's, H bearing? So, I don't know, pH 3 or some other molecule with phosphorus, and looking into how, how it's distributed or how it's evolving in the disk, maybe is good. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so far, PO and PN are the only phosphorus molecules that have been detected in a star-forming region. So people have looked for phosphine, CP, HCP, things that have been detected in sort of the circumstellar, like evolved star environments, but people haven't found them. So I think it would be great if we could detect more things, but right now either we don't know where to look or what to look for, or the abundances are just too low. So I think it's still in a very early stage that we just need to be looking everywhere.
Right. Yeah, but any tracer for kerogen would be nice. I mean, so anything containing hydrogen with the phosphorus would be really nice to look, because I study meteorites, so I feel like kerogen can contain a lot of different stuff. So, okay, thanks.
Great, thank you. So Samantha has a question. Samantha, would you like to ask a question directly?
Oh, yeah, sure. So this was just follow up to Yancey's, I guess, question. So I know that one of these discs had a dimethyl ether detection that was in the news, which I guess is O-bearing, but that was one, disc. And I was wondering if you think that will continue to be a unique case, or if the source was unique, or if you know much about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not going to be impossible to detect large oxygen-bearing molecules, but I think it is just based on sort of the survey work that's been done so far, they're less common and or less abundant. So yeah, definitely, like, it's really interesting and great that we can find these cases where these molecules are detected, and I think they're especially valuable because they're so rare. But I guess I wouldn't sort of count on doing this in a systematic way yet.
Right. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, thank you. So I think it's about the time that we need to let Jenny go. And let's thank the speaker again. Thanks, and then we'll see you next week. Thanks.
The next one was on Tuesday, not on Monday.